kilometers away. The situation was worrying. Just as Bond was considering his position, some glowing lights appeared up ahead, and what had to be the hotel began to sweep into view. The two cars came to a stop in front of the building. With the darkness of the night hiding the evidence of any building work, the brilliantly lit entrance to the hotel looked impressive and convincing enough. James Bond got out of his car and followed Scaramanga inside, where a hotel clerk, dressed in a smart uniform, came to greet them. Bond wrote Mark Hazard and the London address of Transworld Consortium in the hotel register. After speaking for several moments to the hotel manager, Scaramanga turned to Bond and said, "You're in room number 24, in the west wing. I'm close by, in number 20. Order whatever you want from room service. See you at about 10 o'clock in the morning. The guys will be coming in from Kingston at around midday, okay?" The expressionless face and cold eyes did not care if it was okay or not. Bond said it was. Once inside the pleasant, modern double bedroom, Bond turned off the air conditioning. He had never liked the idea of it, and opened the window. Then he inspected the room in detail. He checked behind the paintings on the walls and under the bed, and then he slowly unscrewed the bottom plate of the telephone. As he suspected, he discovered a small microphone, which had been connected to the main cable inside. He smiled to himself, left the microphone untouched, and then carefully replaced the bottom plate and put the phone back on the bedside table. He knew this kind of device well. It would be powerful enough to pick up and transmit a conversation from anywhere in the room. James Bond unpacked his few belongings and then called room service and ordered some food. While he was waiting for his food to arrive, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down near the open window. He could hear the waves breaking softly on the nearby beach and could smell the sea air. As he sat holding the glass of whiskey in one hand, he thought about what would happen the next day. It would certainly be interesting to see these fat, frightened shareholders. Bond had a strong suspicion that they would be gangsters, the type of men who owned the Havana hotels and discos, or who were in control in Las Vegas and Miami. And who was Scaramanga working for? Whose money was he representing? It could be anyone in the Caribbean, yet Bond was sure that the money would have come from criminal sources. He was probably still working for the Cuban secret police. And what about the man himself? The incident with the birds certainly proved that Scaramanga knew what he was doing with a gun. How on earth was Bond going to kill him? Later, after eating dinner in his room, Bond pushed his empty suitcase up against the bedroom door and balanced 3 empty glasses on top of it. Although only a simple booby trap, it would give him all the warning he needed if anyone tried to come into his room. Then he undressed, got into bed, and slept. After a night full of disturbing dreams, James Bond woke up at 7:30. He got dressed, had a quick breakfast in his room, and then decided to go for a walk to find out more about the property. It did not take long to get a good picture of the place. The darkness of the night before had covered up a half project. Bond now clearly saw that the east wing of the hotel had only just been started, while in the main section of the building there were workmen everywhere. They were hurriedly fitting carpets, hanging curtains, and even painting walls, but no one was employed on the essentials. The big cement mixers and diggers lay untouched outside. Beyond the newly laid gardens, the wild mangrove swamps spread out far and wide, full of crocodiles, and giving off a strong, unpleasant smell. Bond guessed that the place needed at least another year, and another $5 million before it would be properly finished. Some of the shareholders were not going to be happy when they saw this. They might want to sell their shares in it. But other businessmen might want to buy into it as long as they could do so cheaply, and use it as a tax loss to set against more profitable business elsewhere. Businessmen often preferred to have money in property here because Jamaica gave big tax concessions. That was better than having to pay high taxes to the government in the United States, Cuba, or anywhere else. So Scaramanga planned to blind his guests with pleasure and send them back happy to their syndicates, so that they would recommend buying into the project. Would it work? Bond seriously doubted it. Bond glanced at his watch. It was nearly 10 o'clock. So he walked back to the main reception desk of the hotel. Scaramanga, dressed in another smart suit, was at the desk talking to the manager. He nodded to Bond.
"Let's go and have a look at the conference room," he said.
Bond followed him through the hotel bar to a big, simply furnished room. It had a large, round table with a telephone on it and 7 white leather chairs around it. Bond began to look carefully around the room. He said, "The wall lights could be bugged, and of course the telephone. Do you want me to have a close look at it?" Scaramanga turned to Bond and answered,
"There's no need to. It's definitely bugged. By me. I've got to have a record of exactly what he said."
"All right, then. Where do you want me to be?" Bond asked.
"Sit outside the door," Scaramanga told him. "Read a magazine or something. There'll be a general meeting this afternoon at around 4. Tomorrow there'll be 1 or 2 smaller meetings. I want all these meetings to be private. I don't want anyone to disturb us."
"No problem," replied Bond confidently. "Now, isn't it time you told me the names of these men, who they represent, and which ones, if any, you're expecting trouble from?" Scaramanga picked up a pad of paper and a pencil from the table and handed them to Bond.
"Sit down, then. First, there's Mr. Hendricks. He's a Dutchman, and he represents the European money, mostly Swiss. He's not the arguing type, so he should be okay. Then there's Sam Binion from Detroit. He and his friends are worth about $20 million. Next, there's Leroy Gengerella, Miami. He's big in the entertainment world and owns Gengerella Enterprises. He's the kind of person who wants quick profits. He might be rough. And Ruby Rotkopf, the hotel man from Las Vegas. He'll ask the most difficult questions because he'll already know most of the answers from experience. Hal Garfinkel from Chicago. He's in labor relations, like me, and represents a lot of Teamster Union funds. He shouldn't be any trouble. That makes 5 so far. The last one is Louis Paradise from Phoenix, Arizona. He's involved in casinos and owns Paradise Slots, the biggest company in the one-armed bandit business. I'm not sure what he's going to say.
"And who do you represent, Mr. Scaramanga?" asked Bond casually.
"Caribbean money,"
came the vague reply. "Cuban," said Bond, pushing him further.
"I say Caribbean. Cuba's in the Caribbean, isn't it?"
"Castro or Batista?" insisted Bond. A heavy frown fell on Scaramanga's face, and his right hand formed into a fist.
"Stay out of my business, mister," he warned, "or you'll get hurt, and I mean that."
Then he turned and walked quickly out of the room. James Bond smiled. He looked down at the list of names in front of him. It certainly looked like a suspicious group of men. But the name he was most interested in was Mr. Hendricks, who represented European money. Bond felt sure that this man was probably not what he seemed. Bond picked up the pad of paper and walked back to the hotel reception area. A large man was approaching the desk from the entrance. He looked hot and uncomfortable in his formal suit. He looked like a typical European businessman, a German dentist, or a Swiss banker. He put down his heavy suitcase next to the reception desk and said, in a heavy European accent, and with poor English grammar, "It is Mr. Hendricks. I think it is that you are having a room for me, isn't it?" Chapter 8. The 6 Men. The men on the list had begun to arrive. Scaramanga was there in the hotel lobby to greet them, and Bond stood nearby, mentally trying to match each man to one of the names on the list as they came through the door. They all looked quite similar, dark-faced, clean-shaven, hard eyes, and each one carried a briefcase. Bond also noticed that 1 or 2 of them were carrying guns under their suit jackets. Once they had all arrived, Scaramanga walked over to Bond and told him, "See you in the bar around 12 o'clock. I'll be introducing you as my personal assistant." Bond nodded before strolling off in the direction of his bedroom. When he walked into the room, he carefully checked that everything was exactly as it had been when he had left the room at about 9 o'clock that morning. His razor was a couple of millimeters closer to the basin than it had been before. He now knew, without question, that his room had been searched while he was out, and that a real expert had done it. Bond was pleased. It was good to know that at last the fight really had begun. He took a shower, and afterwards he looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and smiled. At last, after so many difficult months, he saw the real James Bond looking back at him. He felt a wave of excitement pass through him. He was ready for this mission. When Bond walked into the bar just an hour or so later, all the men were already there, wearing more relaxed clothes and drinking champagne. Scaramanga stood leaning against the bar and was spinning his golden gun round and round on the first finger of his right hand, like a character from an old Western film. As the door closed with a click behind Bond, Scaramanga swung round, and the golden gun suddenly stopped in mid-turn, its barrel pointing directly at Bond's stomach. "Guys," said Scaramanga loudly, "meet my personal assistant, Mr. Mark Hazard, from London, England. He's come along to make sure things run smoothly this weekend. Mark, come here and meet everyone." He lowered the gun and pushed it into the top of his trousers. Bond, knowing that this was his chance to get to know more about the men, smiled and walked up to the bar. He ordered a gin and began to move among the gangsters, making small talk. With one man he asked how his flight had been. With another he inquired about the weather in the United States and commented on the beautiful scenery in Jamaica. As he talked to each man, he made a mental note of his voice and recalled his name. After a while, Bond walked purposefully towards Mr. Hendricks and tried to start a conversation. "It seems we're the only 2 Europeans here. I gather you're from Holland. I've often passed through it, but never stayed there. It's a beautiful country," commented Bond. "Yes," answered Hendricks simply, and with a heavy accent. "What part do you come from?" Bond inquired. "Den Haag," came the short reply. "Have you lived there long?" asked Bond. "Many years," replied Hendricks. "It's a very beautiful town," said Bond. "Yes," said Hendricks, without interest. Bond waited a moment to see if he would add anything further, but nothing happened. "Is this your first visit to Jamaica?" asked Bond, hoping to get more than one word in reply. "No," replied the Dutchman, and he looked straight past Bond in the direction of the bar. "Excuse me, please," he added dryly, and then moved away. He walked over to Scaramanga, who was standing alone, leaning against the bar. Mr. Hendricks said something, and his words acted like a command on the other man. Mr. Scaramanga stood up straight and immediately followed Mr. Hendricks into a far corner of the room. Then he stood and listened carefully as Mr. Hendricks talked rapidly, in a low voice. Bond watched the scene closely. He noted with interest the way in which Scaramanga, who, until now, had been full of arrogance and self-importance, treated this man with respect and deference. Seeing Mr. Hendricks now, Bond guessed that he must be part of either the Mafia or the KGB. After having lunch together, the group of men split up and went to their rooms to rest for a few hours before the conference started. Later that afternoon, as Bond returned from his room and walked through the lobby, the hotel manager came out from behind the reception desk. Mr. Hazard? Yes, answered Bond. I don't think you've met my assistant manager, Mr. Travis, he stated. No, I don't think I have, said Bond. Would you like to step into my office for a moment and meet him? He asked politely. Later, perhaps. I'm on my way to the conference, Bond explained. The smartly dressed man came a step closer, then said quietly, He particularly wants to meet you, Mr. Bond. Bond suddenly understood. This man was clearly also working undercover, like him, and possibly wanted to introduce him to another agent. Right, agreed Bond. We'd better make it quick. The manager stepped behind the desk and opened a door. Bond went in, and the manager closed the door behind them. A tall, slim man was standing with his back to them, leaning over a desk. He turned. He had straight, fair hair, a bronzed Texan face, and instead of a right hand he had a bright metal hook. Bond stopped in his tracks. A broad smile spread across his face, and his eyes shone with joy. "Felix Leiter, I can't believe it's you!" he cried, and went up to the man and gave him a friendly punch on the shoulder. The face was slightly more lined than Bond remembered, but the man's smile was just as friendly and warm as it had always been. The men knew each other well. Leiter was in the CIA, and had worked with Bond on several previous missions. They had been through a lot together, and during one very challenging mission several years earlier, Leiter had lost his right arm and part of his left leg to a shark. Bond was hugely relieved to know that Leiter was also working for Scaramanga, and that he would no longer be working on this mission alone. Chapter 9. The Conference. James Bond left the reception area and quickly made his way to the bar. When he got there, he saw that all the men were already seated around the table in the adjacent conference room, and that Scaramanga was waiting impatiently by the door. "Right," he said, looking directly into Bond's eyes. "Lock the door and wait outside while we're talking. Don't let anyone in. Not even if the hotel catches fire." And with that, he turned and went inside to join the other 6 men. Bond looked into the room and noted the seating order before he closed and locked the door, as he had been told to do. He then quickly locked the other door, which led from the bar into the hotel lobby. Moving quietly and rapidly, he picked up a champagne glass from the bar and placed the bowl of the glass against the conference room door. Holding the glass by the stem, he placed his left ear against its base and listened. What had been the unintelligible rumble of a voice now became Mr. Hendricks speaking. "And I have a very important message for our chairman from my superiors in Europe. It is from a sure source. There is a man called James Bond who is looking for him here. This is a man who is from the British Secret Service. I have no information or description of this man,
but my superiors believe that he is a serious threat. Mr. Scaramanga, have you heard of him?"
Scaramanga laughed loudly.
"No, I haven't, and should I care? I eat one of their famous secret agents for breakfast from time to time. Only 10 days ago, I killed one of them who came looking for me, the man called Ross. His body is now very slowly sinking to the bottom of an oil lake in Trinidad. Next question, please, Mr. Hendricks."
"We must talk about the Kane sabotage," began Hendricks. "At our meeting 6 months ago in Havana, it was decided to help Fidel Castro to maintain and even increase the world price of sugar to balance out the damage caused by Hurricane Flora. Our help would be in exchange for certain favors from him. This decision was taken against my wishes. Since that time, there have been a lot of fires in the sugarcane fields of Jamaica and Trinidad, and my superiors have discovered that some members of this group, Mr. Gengerella, Mr. Rotkopf, Mr. Binion, and indeed our chairman, have been purchasing large quantities of July sugar futures in order to make money for themselves." There came low, angry voices from around the table.
"Why shouldn't we?" shouted Gengerella. "Who said we weren't allowed to make money? Isn't that one of the reasons we are all here? I asked you 6 months ago, Mr. Hendricks, and I'll ask you again now. Which of your superiors wants to keep the price of raw sugar down? Huh? My guess is that it's Soviet Russia. They're selling goods to Cuba, including a recent shipment of missiles to fire against the United States, my homeland, in exchange for raw sugar. Mr. Hendricks, is one of your superiors somebody in the Kremlin?"
The voice of Scaramanga shouted for calm, and a reluctant silence fell.
"When we formed this group, we all agreed to work together," Scaramanga reminded the men. "So, Mr. Hendricks, let me explain. As an investment group, we have good bets and bad bets. Sugar is a good bet, and we should continue to bet on it even if you personally have decided not to be involved in it. Now listen. At this moment, there are 6 ships controlled by this group that are waiting outside New York and other U.S. harbors. These ships are loaded with raw sugar. These ships, Mr. Hendricks, will not dock and unload their sugar until sugar futures, July futures specifically, have risen by another 10 cents. The U.S. government, the sugar lobby, and other powerful groups know this. They know that we have them cornered. They want the ships to dock and the sugar to be unloaded before there's a real shortage and the price rises too high. But there's another side to it. It's costing us a lot of money to have our ships sitting there waiting. So, the situation can't carry on like this forever. One side will win and one side will lose. 4 of us here could win or lose about $10 million. And, at the same time, our investment in this Thunderbird Hotel isn't looking good. It's in the red. So, what do you think, Mr. Hendricks? Of course we burn the sugar crops if we can get away with it. I know the right people in Jamaica, and I pay them to do the job for us. That's how it works. So you just tell your superiors that what goes up must come down. Huh? And that's true for the price of sugar, like anything else. Okay.
There was a moment of silence before Mr. Hendricks spoke.
I will pass on what you say, but they will not be happy.
Then he added,
Now, there is the question of this hotel. What is the exact financial situation? I think we all want to know the truth.
There was a murmur of agreement around the table, and then Scaramanga began a long and detailed explanation, which was of little interest to Bond. In any case, Felix Leiter had told him that the whole meeting would be secretly recorded on electronic equipment in the small room where they had seen each other earlier. Leiter was working with the smart American hotel manager, an undercover electronics expert in the CIA, whose real name was Nick Nicholson. And their job was to get a better understanding of the members of the group and what they were trying to do. Leiter had confirmed what Bond had suspected. Hendricks was, in fact, a top man in the KGB. The CIA believed that Gengerella was a member of the Mafia. This was therefore a worrying situation. The first time that a Mafia member had been found working with the KGB. And it would need to be ended, Leiter said, by removing someone, if necessary. Bond had explained his own mission to Leiter and Nicholson, and they had agreed that they should continue to work separately, but they would support each other if the need arose. So now Bond was on his own outside the conference room, and Scaramanga was just finishing what he was saying.
So, in summary, gentlemen, we need to find another $10 million. The interests that I represent, which are the majority of the interests, believe that a loan for this amount of money should be provided to the project by all of us. We would be paid interest at a rate of 10%, and the loan would be repayable in 10 years.
The voice of Mr. Rotkopf broke in angrily.
Not on your life. What about the 7% second mortgage my friends and I agreed to only a year ago? If I went back to Las Vegas and told them about this new loan, what do you think they would do to me? We don't have a choice. It's that or the hotel closes, responded Scaramanga calmly. What do you other guys say?
Hendricks said,
10% is a very good rate. My friends and I will lend $1 million as long as the agreement is clear and fair.
Okay, Mr.
Binion murmured reluctantly.
Count us in for the same amount, but this had better be the last time.
In turn, the other men all agreed to lend a share of the money, although Mr. Rotkopf was still unhappy.
No, I don't want any part of this, he said firmly. As soon as I get back, I'm going to find the best lawyers in the States. You can't just cancel that mortgage.
There was silence. The voice of Scaramanga was soft and deadly.
You're making a big mistake. This is a nice big tax loss to balance out your Las Vegas business interests. And don't forget that we all promised each other that we would work together. Are you sure your answer is no?
I am absolutely sure,
he stated decisively.
Would this help to change your mind?
Scaramanga said coldly. There was a loud gunshot and a sudden scream of terror. Something, possibly a chair, fell to the floor with a crash, and then there was silence. Then someone coughed nervously, and Mr. Gengerella said calmly,
I think that was the right solution to an embarrassing difference of opinion. Mr. Rotkopf's friends in Las Vegas like a quiet life. I'm sure they won't even complain. Let's say that he has agreed that he and his friends will put in $1 million. Shall we?
Yes,
that's right,
came Scaramanga's voice, happy and relaxed.
Mr. Rotkopf has left here to go back to Las Vegas. We never saw him again. We don't know anything, do we? I've got some hungry crocodiles out there in these swamps that need feeding. There'll be nothing left of poor Mr. Rotkopf after they've had their dinner. I'll need some help with it tonight, though. Can you come with me, Gengerella? And you, Paradise?
No, not me,
pleaded the voice of Mr. Paradise.
It's against my religion.
Mr. Hendricks said,
I will take his place. I am not a religious person.
Fine, said Scaramanga, and added, Well, guys, is there any other business to discuss? If not, we'll finish the meeting and have a drink.
Hal Garfinkel broke in nervously.
Just a minute. What about that British guy outside the door? He must have heard the gunshot. What's he gonna say about it?
Mr. Scaramanga's laugh was dry and cruel.
Don't worry about him. I picked him up in a bar a few kilometers away. I've only got temporary staff here to make sure you guys have a good time this weekend. And he's the most temporary of all of them. Those crocodiles really are hungry. Rotkopf will be the main course, but they'll need a dessert. For all I know, he might be this James Bond man Mr. Hendricks has told us about. No, don't you worry about the British guy. I'll sort him out.
Bond carried the empty champagne glass over to the bar and slowly filled it with champagne. At that moment he heard Scaramanga turning his key in the lock. Scaramanga looked at Bond from the doorway.
Okay, that's enough champagne. Go to the manager and tell him Mr. Rotkopf will be checking out tonight. And say that a major fuse blew during the meeting, and no one can go into this room, and that I'm going to find out why we're having so much bad workmanship around the place. Okay? Then, is drinks, dinner, and dancing girls. Got it?
James Bond said that he understood. He was slightly unsteady on his feet as he walked towards the lobby door and unlocked it. Yes, he understood. Mr. Rotkopf was dead, and Bond was the next person on Scaramanga's list. He understood only too well what the situation was. Chapter 10. The Dinner Party. Back in the small office behind the hotel reception desk, James Bond quickly went over the key parts of the meeting with Leiter and Nicholson. They all agreed that they had enough evidence recorded on tape to have Scaramanga locked away in prison for the rest of his life. Leiter planned to follow the men later that night, when they got rid of Rotkopf's dead body. He wanted to try and get enough evidence to take Garfinkel and Hendricks to court as well. Bond returned to his room, poured himself a large whisky, and then lay on his bed thinking about the day's events. One thing was certainly clear. He now found himself in a very delicate and dangerous situation. When Bond joined the others for dinner, he could sense that things had changed. The men now seemed to be avoiding him. They knew the boss did not trust him and wanted him dead. He was certainly not someone they now wanted to be friendly with. The restaurant had been decorated with tropical plants and colourful fruits, and as the men ate their meal, a calypso band was playing rather too loudly on the stage. A pretty girl, dressed in a bright red and gold costume, and wearing a large, false pineapple on top of her head, was singing a slow song unenthusiastically. Bond was finding the evening extremely boring. The food was unremarkable, and the other guests were ignoring him. He got up and went to the head of the table. He told Scaramanga, "I've got a headache. I'm going to bed."
"No,"
Scaramanga declared quite forcefully, looking coldly at Bond.
"If you think the evening isn't going well, make it go better. That's what you're being paid for. Do something about it."
It was many years since James Bond had accepted a dare. He felt the eyes of the group watching him, waiting to see what would happen next. Stupidly, he wanted to show these men, who thought him unimportant, what he could do. He did not stop to think that it would have been better for him to keep quiet at that moment. Instead, he said decisively, "All right, Mr. Scaramanga. Give me $100 note and your gun." Scaramanga did not move. He looked up at Bond with surprise and uncertainty. Mr. Paradise shouted, "Come on! Let's see what he can do!" Scaramanga reached for his wallet and slowly took out a folded $100 note. Next, he carefully reached into his waistband and pulled out his gun. He laid the golden gun and the note on the table in front of him. With his back to the stage, James Bond picked up the gun and checked that it was loaded. At once Bond turned, dropped onto one knee so that his aim would be above the musicians on the stage, and shot the gun. The explosion was deafening, and the music stopped immediately. There was a tense silence. What was left of the false pineapple fell to the floor with a thud. A second later, the girl put her hands to her face and slowly fell down onto the floor. As the men started to comment to each other in low voices, Bond picked up the $100 note and approached the girl. He lifted her up by her arm and pushed the folded note into her hand.
"That was a fine act we did together. Don't worry, you were in no danger. I aimed for the top half of the pineapple. Now, run off and get ready for your next song."
He turned her round and gave her a gentle push. She gave him a horrified glance and ran off into the shadows. Bond turned to the band.
"All right then, listen to me. This isn't a tea party. Mr. Scaramanga's friends want some action and some fun. You can drink as much rum as you want, but you'd better start playing some decent music. I want that pretty girl back and her friends, and I want them to dance down here, near where we're sitting, not up on the stage. Do you understand? Now, unless you get moving, I'll finish this show now, and there'll be no money. Okay? Then let's go."
There was nervous laughter from the band as they exchanged smiles, and one of the men ran off after the girl. Bond walked back and laid the pistol down in front of Scaramanga, who gave Bond a long, questioning look, and then pushed the gun back into his waistband. After Bond's impressive act, the atmosphere lifted, and the evening became a success. It had been a risk, but it had paid off, and it wasn't until the early hours of the morning that Bond slipped away back to his room. With relief, Bond took a shower and climbed into bed. He worried for a while about having shown off with the gun, but it was a stupid mistake that he could not change now. He soon went to sleep and dreamt of 3 dark figures dragging a shapeless, heavy weight towards dark waters that were full of long, twisting, snapping crocodiles. Chapter 11. Unexpected Visitors. A soft tapping sound woke Bond from his restless sleep. It took him a moment to realize that the tapping noise was coming from behind the curtains. He quietly picked up his gun and crept along the wall to the edge of the curtains. He pulled them aside with one quick movement. The golden blonde hair was immediately visible in the moonlight through the half-open window. Mary Goodnight was looking at him through the glass. Bond breathed a sigh of relief. He put down his gun, carefully opened the window fully, and helped Goodnight to climb into the room. There was a bang as the window snapped shut, and they both froze. After a moment or two, he quietly guided her through the moonlit room and into the bathroom. After closing the door and turning on the taps to cover the sound of their conversation, he said firmly, "What on earth are you doing here, Mary?" Her voice was desperate. "I had to come. I had to find you somehow. I went to that bar, and the girl there told me where she thought you'd gone. I left the car in the trees at the bottom of the hotel drive and crept up here. I didn't know where you were, but then I saw the open window, and I just somehow knew that you would be the only one to sleep with your window open. So I took the chance." "What's happened?" asked Bond. There's an urgent message from headquarters. They said it had to be given to you at all costs. They think you are in Havana, but they said that one of the KGB top men who goes by the name Hendricks is staying at this hotel. You must stay away from him. Apparently, one of his jobs is to find you and, kill you. So, I put two and two together, and knowing you were in this corner of the island, I thought you might already be on his track, but that you might not know he was looking for you, while you were looking for him, if that makes sense." There was a pause, while Bond thought. Then he responded, "Yes, he's here, that's for sure. And so is a gunman called Scaramanga. You might as well know, Mary, that Scaramanga killed Ross in Trinidad." She put her hand to her mouth in shock. "And as for Hendricks," continued Bond, "he's here, all right, although I don't think he's identified me for certain. But don't worry, I think I can handle the situation. Besides, I've got help." He told her about Felix Leiter and Nicholson. "Now, we've got to get you out of here. Just tell headquarters that you've delivered the message, that I'm here, and that the two CIA men are here as well." With that, he gently put a hand on her shoulder, then turned off the taps and opened the bathroom door. As they stepped back into the room, a steady voice came from the darkness at the end of the bed.
"Step forward, both of you. Put your hands together behind your head."
Scaramanga walked to the door and turned the lights on. The golden gun remained pointing at Bond as he moved. Bond looked at him in disbelief. He looked towards the bedroom door. His case was there, as it had been the night before, with the glasses balanced on top. And Scaramanga could not possibly have got through the small window on his own. Then he saw that the wardrobe was open, and a light was shining through it from the room next door. It was the simplest of secret doors, just the hole of the back of the cupboard, and it would have been impossible for Bond to discover it while checking his room. Scaramanga stood looking at both of them.
"I didn't see this dancer on the stage tonight. Where has she come from?" he said accusingly.
"We're engaged to be married," stated Bond, thinking quickly. "She's a clerk at the British High Commissioner's office in Kingston. Her name's Mary Goodnight. She found out where I was staying from that bar where you and I met, and came out to tell me that my mother's in hospital in London. She's had a bad fall." Bond then challenged Scaramanga, adding a note of anger to his voice. "What's wrong with that? And what do you think you are doing, coming into my room in the middle of the night, waving a gun around?" After a pause, he dropped his hands to his sides and turned to the girl. "Put your hands down, Mary. Mr. Scaramanga must have thought there were burglars in here when he heard the window slam shut. Now, you'd better be going. You've got a long drive back to Kingston." Mary began to play her part in the story. "Gosh, yes, I'd better go," she said, as she picked up her small bag from the bed where she had dropped it. "I really mustn't be late into the office in the morning. I'm organising a big party for the Prime Minister, and it's tomorrow, so I've a lot to do. So, Mr. Scramble, I'm terribly sorry for waking you up." And she stepped forward between Bond and Scaramanga and offered him her hand to shake. But Scaramanga was not going to be taken in so easily.
"Stop there, lady. And you, mister, stay where you are."
Mary Goodnight let her hand fall to her side and looked at him questioningly, as though he had just refused a cup of tea. A second passed, yet it felt like an eternity, before Scaramanga conceded,
"Okay, I believe you. Put her through the window again."
He waved his gun at the girl.
"Okay, get moving, and don't come back."
Bond led Goodnight to the window and hurriedly helped to push her out. Then he moved away from the window and sat down on the bed with considerable relief. He could feel the hard shape of his gun under the pillow against his leg. Scaramanga had put his gun away and was leaning against the wall.
"The High Commissioner's office," he said, and paused. "That also houses the representative of your famous Secret Service, doesn't it? I wonder, Mr. Hazard, if your real name isn't James Bond. You were pretty quick with that gun tonight. I seem to have heard somewhere that this man Bond likes his guns. I also have information that he's somewhere in the Caribbean, and that he's looking for me. Quite a coincidence, don't you think?"
Bond laughed easily. "I thought they'd got rid of that Secret Service years ago. I am who I say I am. All you've got to do is call Mr. Tony Hugill, the boss up at Frome, and check on my story. And can you explain how this Bond man could possibly have tracked you down to a sleepy bar in Savannah-la-Mar? And what does he want from you, anyway?" Scaramanga watched him silently for a while, weighing up the evidence. Then he spoke in a serious tone.
"You just remember this, mister. If it turns out you're not who you say you are, I'll shoot you dead. Got it?"
There was silence, while the men looked at each other. Bond said nothing.
"No, you'd better get some sleep," said Scaramanga. "I've got a meeting at 10 o'clock in the conference room with Hendricks, and I don't want to be disturbed. After that, we're all going for a ride down to Green Island Harbor on that train I was telling you about. It'll be your job to make sure that the trip is well organized. Talk to the hotel manager first thing in the morning. All right?"
Scaramanga did not wait for an answer. He walked into the wardrobe, pushed Bond's suit to one side, and disappeared. Chapter 12. Bad News. The next morning, Bond arrived at the conference room a few minutes before 10 o'clock. The evidence of the day before was still there to be seen. The chairs were roughly in their correct positions, but the ashtrays had not been emptied. Bond looked for stains on the carpet, or for signs that the carpet had been washed, but there were none. Rotkopf had probably been killed by a single bullet through the heart. Bond tidied the room and then dutifully started to examine the windows and curtains. At that moment, in walked Scaramanga, followed by Hendricks. He said roughly,
"Okay, Mr. Hazard. Lock both doors like yesterday. No one comes in, right?"
"Yes," affirmed Bond, and he then went out and locked the door. Again he fetched a champagne glass and took up his position listening through the door. Immediately, Hendricks began talking, quickly and urgently.
"Mr. S., I have bad troubles to report. I spoke with my people in Havana this morning. They have heard direct from Moscow. That man, the man outside this room right now, is the British secret agent James Bond. They have given me his description, and the scar down the right side of his face leaves no doubt. And his shooting last night."
There was a pause, and then Hendricks spoke in a calmer, more threatening tone.
"But how can this have happened? What a shocking mistake! If it weren't for the watchfulness of my superiors, who knows what damage this man might have done? I must give my superiors a full report. You must tell me exactly how this man ended up working for you in this way."
There was silence. Bond imagined Scaramanga sitting back in his chair, looking directly into the eyes of Mr. Hendricks. The voice, when it came, was decisive and firm.
"Mr. Hendricks, thank you for this information and for your concern. However, tell your people this. I met this man completely by accident. At least I thought so at the time. So there is no point in worrying about how it has happened. It hasn't been easy to set up this conference so quickly, and I needed help. Someone to make things go smoothly. These guys seemed okay. But I'm not stupid. I knew that when this was all over I'd have to get rid of him, just in case he'd learned anything he shouldn't have. Now, you say he's a member of the Secret Service. What you've told me only changes one thing. He'll die today, instead of tomorrow. And here's how it's going to happen.
Scaramanga lowered his voice. Now Bond could only hear a few words of what was being said. The sweat ran down his ear as he pressed it to the bottom of the champagne glass.
Old train trip. Rats in the sugar cane. Unfortunate accident. Before I do it, a big love.
There was a pause, and then Scaramanga went on in a louder voice.
So you can relax. There'll be nothing left of the guy by this evening, okay?